I'm going to go ahead and move us on from where we were. We were kind of pushing through modernism, especially in the United States. We had kind of ended in this kind of Pollock mode, Jackson Pollock mode, thinking about the problems of painting and a couple theories on how to interpret abstraction and where it's headed. So we're in kind of 50s era, and what you're looking at right now is a still image of a composition by the artist John Cage. This is called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. That's the name of the composition. Imagine you're in tune with John Cage and his work, and he's an experimental musician and composer of the time, and you have tickets to go see him in concert. And what he's known for at this time generally is making musical compositions out of odd materials. So he'll use instruments, for instance, like he'll compose music out of just using kitchen materials, like pots and pans and the sounds of a kitchen. So he'll have a tea kettle going, or dishes going, or the sink running, those kind of things. And he is trying to make an argument for broadening how we think about sound. So you're going to this concert. You kind of have in mind that you're going to go see something fairly radical in terms of music. And you're sitting in the audience, and on stage there's a piano. John Cage comes out, he sits down at the piano, and he opens the keyboard and just hovers his hands over the keys. And this is what you see is this person standing there, but there's he's not playing the keys, so he's just hovering there. So what I want to do in this exercise is I want to sit for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And I want you to sit with this as well. I know you have a recording, you can fast forward through this if you want, but if you're willing to sit through it and entertain this exercise, I think it'll lead us into a good conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and push play on my timer, and we're going to sit. So that ends that composition. So again, coming back, imagine you're sitting there watching John Cage from an audience, and you're probably like me, stirring in your seat and starting to recognize all the kind of small and minute sounds that go on around you. Obviously at the time this was a pretty controversial piece. People were pretty upset by, I can imagine, by purchasing tickets to this composition and sitting there while John Cage wasn't technically playing an instrument. Now, what this is going to lead us into is a conversation around some of our ideas. Let me get out of this. Let me see if this will let me. So, some of our ideas around this kind of cultural conditioning and thinking about our expectations in general. So when we see a work like this, and you're as an audience member starting to be frustrated by not receiving what you expected, this starts to tease out some of the ideas and thoughts around postmodernity, where we've gone or exited some of the abstraction or some of the thoughts around abstraction into a different realm. So we talked in class a lot about this idea of the activated spectator. This might be some of the early underpinnings of some of that. So this idea that as a viewer, artists are starting to expect you to acknowledge your viewing and to see yourself seeing or playing a role in the consumption of artwork. And so this relationship, we call this subject-object relationship. So the viewer in relationship to the thing or the object, it starts to flip. And so you're looking at it, it's looking at you. The subject-object relationship is kind of constantly bouncing back and forth. And we saw some of that when we were starting to talk about Pollock and abstraction and the kind of understanding or the witnessing that you're looking at a material and thinking about why someone would make a painting like Jackson Pollock. Just that kind of question starts to get into thinking about not just the world, but your position in the world. So with that in mind, I'd like you to reflect on some of the sounds you heard. And so if we were in the classroom, we probably would be hearing the ventilation system, or we'd hear someone stirring or opening their notebook, or maybe someone comes in late and sits down and doesn't realize what we're doing, and there's a little bustle going on. What John Cage would argue is that those are all sounds, and the general notion or cultural conditioning that we've had has told us that notes or the music that can be made or is relegated to a certain prescription of notes, say on a piano or on a keyboard, and there's no out of bounds for that contributes. And he's saying, no, there's a whole plethora of sound contributing to a composition, especially in a live performance. And so all the chatter, the movements in your seat, someone coughing, sneezing, he's trying to say that those are all not only part of the experience that you're having, the audible experience you're having, but that those can all be shaped and molded and reflected on, or actually become the content of a composition. So moving forward though, so John Cage, his composition points us towards silence and the rest, which helps us experience everything around us. The structure, our expectations, what the audience is supposed to do, or the performer. So we're going to start seeing a lot of artworks and artists start to question this, and expectations is going to be a key term that comes up again and again in this period moving forward. So bringing us back to Jackson Pollock, one of the things we want to remember is that there's two ideas about how to interpret Pollock. So we have our Clement Greenberg, which if we remember, comes up with this idea of formalism, and the paintings are stripped of their associations, like illusion, or its reference to literature or a narrative, and it's concerned, or excessively concerned, with form and technique rather than the content in an artist's creation. And so in essence, the artwork and the art is contained in the object. That's one of the main things you want to remember there. So what comes of this read, we're gonna shift into a more post-Painterlian. We'll get into the other interpretation of a Pollock in a second, but I want to show you where some of the formalist trajectory goes. And so right here we're thinking about minimalism. So this kind of post-painterly abstraction minimalism comes out of some of these ideas that Greenberg puts forward. So the work is self-contained, or is even self-referential. It's about itself. So about paint, for example. We would ask questions like, how does form mean? How do we create internally consistent or self-referential form and structure? Art that is about its own making. And we'll use some examples. So 1959, this is a painting by Frank Stella. And something to understand about Frank Stella is that he's coming up with a methodology or a approach to making the painting that is self-referential explicitly, not just in its form, but in its making. And so if we're looking at this picture of him in a studio, one of the things I want you to notice here is that Frank Stella will go to the hardware store and buy a standard paintbrush that would normally be used for painting a house or home. He'll use rollers, paint rollers in this way as well. And what he's done is he's creating these stripes that are the distance of the exact width of that brush. And therefore, the painting and the form all are dictated by that dimension of that brush. And so he's coming up with a calculation that he can start here and evolve outward in this dimension, in these stripes, over and over and over, in a way that the end result of this painting is dictated, the dimensions are dictated by the material that's being used to make that painting. And so that's pretty key. And you'll even notice that the distance off of the wall is that same dimension there as well. So in essence, the painting starts to turn even sculptural, becomes sculptural in a way where there's a logical progression to the dimensions, but it's also less of an illusion here of a surface, a 2D surface, and becomes about the dimension you're witnessing in a 2D plane, and then reaffirmed by its distance off of the wall. So it's doing all these really, really interesting things. Or we get Ellsworth Kelly, red, yellow, blue, number 2 from 1964. And Ellsworth Kelly would make a case that when trying to determine what's the meaning of this work, Ellsworth Kelly would say the meaning is red, yellow, blue. And it's literal. That's the extent that the artist wants you to interpret this work. So sculpture is another realm that minimalism starts to play out. And Donald Judd is a good example for us. This is Untitled 1968 on the left, because so much emphasis is on the paintings as objects that have form. So we've used this in sculpture. They start to want to distance themselves from calling things sculptures, and they start to call them presences, because they're trying to, just like in painting, they're trying to break with the historical traditions. So you'll notice the sculptures aren't sitting on plinths, which are those kind of traditional bases that a sculpture would rest on to delineate itself from everything else. This is Donald Judd, and he's come up with a process by making sculptures that have, again, a self-referential component that defines its own form. So, for instance, these shapes here are reiterated here by the negative space, and so the dictation of how far off the ground and how much space is between is the same dimension of the positive shapes in this. Another factor here in his work that's good to recognize and think about is a kind of reflection of the time and the critique of sculpture and painting, which is the materiality of the objects themselves gets called into question, and so that desire to distance themselves from maybe the biography of the artist, or those kind of terms that we've brought up as a read of formalism. We see that these are all manufactured by machines, and they're not made by humans anymore, specifically, or they're trying to eradicate the hand of the human. So kind of like Pollock dripping paint and not putting the brush to the canvas, these artists are extending some of those ideas and those thoughts by having everything manufactured in a way that reflects the kind of time period, right? That where everything's becoming mass produced, everything's calculated by machines and precision. So he's kind of reflecting that worldview for us. If you want to watch a video about Donald Judd, please go ahead and I'll include this link to this presentation, so you can just push play here and learn a little bit more. It's pretty fascinating. This is a short video. So Harold Rosenberg, there's another read of Pollock, right, that we talked about, and this would be a look at the activity or the action of Pollock's work, and rather than just formalism, it's referencing a whole lot of things like the life of the artist, the decisions made through the process of making the painting, the dialogue with the historic traditions or conventions of painting. His paintings are not just self-contained objects, according to Rosenberg, but references to much of its context or the time period in which they're made. And so this read, when looking at Pollock in this photograph, he would say this is might be interpreted as a performance of sorts, and we're seeing the remnants and the artifact as a record of that performance. And so one of the things he'll ask us to think about is as a viewer, so if you're coming to Pollock's work, Harold Rosenberg would say, what does it mean to do this, rather than just what is it about? What's it mean to make this painting? And he pushes us toward this work that gets, I would say, really conceptual and starts to get pretty heavily philosophic. So Rauschenberg, we talked about, he's the one who did the erase de Kooning. he starts to push us toward what's called the pure picture plane, or in his interpretation of the work is pushing us toward I think what he would say is the logical end of sorts to the argument that's being made by Greenberg. But he takes up more of Harold's position, that Rosenberg's position, that this is much more about your surroundings and your life and your place within it. So he says a lot of his work is about considering yourself and the world around you, the stuff of life, the studio, the stuff that helps us understand art. His work turns toward the stuff of cultural exchange. And so let's look at some of his work. So early on, he's making these 3-panel pieces in 1951. Let me see, they look like this when they're installed. And so you're looking at 3 panels. We'll look at this one on the right. 3 panels, and they're just what they look like. They're often, I think, just painted by house paint, white house paint, or the same kind of paint that you would see used on the wall of a gallery or museum in itself. They're portrait in individual form, but then they make up a landscape. They're lit in these galleries as if they were, just a regular painting, and so one of the interpretation of these white paintings, one is that they're not meant to be appreciated as a white painting that's self-contained. They become what will be called by John Cage as kind of landing fields of sorts. And so the way that I've always interpreted this is that when you look at these, they're meant to reflect to us the lighting in the room, the space, the wall that they're hung on, even the way that they have contrast with the wood floors in the room, and they start to ask a viewer to see all the things that frame the white painting and its presentation. And so that, if you take that literally, you start to see yourself as someone who's walking into a constructed viewing space. And that construction is part of that kind of cultural conditioning that says that paintings are meant to reflect and be viewed in these certain settings, in these certain situations, with this certain lighting. And if you do that, you get to some of those ideas that John Cage is talking about, like, what are your expectations when you walk into a space? Do you ever notice all of those other elements in a space that contribute to the meaning of the work? So if we were thinking about John Cage and his 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and all the sound that goes on in a space contributing to the experience and having an effect on your expectations of what you want from the artwork, these paintings are doing a similar thing visually. So he'll start to spend a good period of his time collecting objects and artifacts from, in essence, trash, from a very tight square block area of his studio. So he'll spend time walking around the immediate neighborhood he's making work in, and collecting things and putting them directly onto a painting surface and making these combines or collages. He calls them combines, but notice the title's collection. And that brings us here to John Cage again. I wanted to see if I had another. I do have a couple more works by Rauschenberg, so I'll get there in a second. But so the argument being made here is that the art, or where the art happens in this work, it's not in the object anymore. So where is it? So maybe it's in the concept that an artist sets in motion, using the structure of something like music, or a music hall or performance, like John Cage, to initiate an experience on the part of the audience or viewer, and using that to ask us to consider or contemplate what he or she or he is doing. This turns us, the viewer, to a place of trying to make sense of what the artist is doing. It's a strategy of interrupting our expectations, and that the art or artwork is in the contemplation of what's happened, what is happening. So, if you were thinking about anthropological definition of culture, which emphasizes culture as a set of everyday and pervasive activities, this allows us for an understanding of mass and popular forms of classification, expression, and communication as legitimate aspects of culture. Therefore, art can give you clues and insights about what it is, or was important at a particular moment in history or in a particular culture. So if we were seeing this as a distinction from formalism in Greenberg's argument, you're seeing that this is a way of interpreting art as more of a mirror reflection of what's going on in the world more generally. So it's letting the world in, let's put it that way. So this might be thought of as a shift from nature to culture. So when we thought about nature in terms of Mona Lisa, right, and we talked about that being a desire for art to mimic the world, this is a shift from that. So we talked about, I don't know if we talked about, I think we did, Mark Rothko. I think we talked about his color-filled paintings, but here again is a combine by Rauschenberg, and you'll see this. This is a painting on the wall that is painted directly onto a chair that's sitting in the space. So, one, there's no real distinction between this being a painting alone or a sculpture alone. It's kind of both. But this painting is being thrown into the world by its blending and attachment to this physical object, the chair. So, what's postmodernity then, and the place we're going to head into? So, remember that modernity is the world or situation of the Industrial Revolution, the Mechanical Age, mechanized labor, mechanical reproduction, printing press, the high-rise building, the car, plane, electricity, all those things we've talked about. We're past that now. We're not organized by the industrial grid as much. Now we're in the information age, organized more like the internet, the exchange of information, globalization, web, etc. There's a multiplicity of relationships, multiple languages, multiple ways of thinking, all in contact with one another. There's no central center necessarily. The internet, right, is a way of seeing that or imaging that. It's ever-changing, it's unstable, instable. I think that was meant to say unstable, and much more complex. So, this is a good reflection to have right now, because this is not unlike some of the current situation we're in with this pandemic, right? And the ability to witness how intertwined and how complicated situation can be in one part of the world, and how much of an impact that can have on another part. Whereas not too long ago, we were kind of less intertwined, or there's the ability to have something happen on the other part of the planet that didn't have any impact at all on other parts of the planet. So throughout modernism, there was a focus on the individual, this existential liberation, which believed in a sort of universal beauty. So think Picasso and Pollock in a way that we have. This is radical stuff at the time, but it turned out that the only people that were acting as authorities on this stuff were Western white men generally, for the most part. They believed that universal beauty or form, etc., also in architecture, was in the object. There was a belief that the thing had its own qualities and they were autonomous. Then the postmodernists came along and they were like, wait, you don't get to decide what beauty is for me. This was the beginning of an emphasis on pluralism, or a multiplicity of voices. Also a sense that meaning was not located in the thing or the world, but in us, in the acculturated mind of this subject. So this is a huge fragmentation that took place. And so I like to think about, and I brought this up in class already, that modernism for me is this kind of emphasis on linear progression. So we're just putting one foot in front of the other, where the postmodernist is starting to say, wait, what about out and around? And so they'll take up this idea that history is just as much defined by the winners as the losers. And if we don't give voice or understand the impact and those voices coming from a losing position, or losing is not always the best word, but a much broader multiplicity of perspectives on any given time, place, event, then we're not getting the full picture. So this kind of idea of seeing ourselves seeing art begins to make us self-conscious. Okay, so what's the big deal? The problem is that when you say there's no universal truths, we begin to feel like we're walking on shaky ground. That all is subjective, right? That everything's just about what I think it is. This showed up in artwork with the introduction of women and minorities, feminist performance art, new realism, all of it. It's a huge fragmentation. So what then is postmodernism? In general, it's a constellation of ideas. And the most predominant thing I want you to remember here is that there's emphasis on there being no neutral place to stand. There's no neutrality. And so if modernism was an attempt to rationally organize our lives and our societies, philosophies, mathematics, and our science, everything became a science, breaking things down, finding things objectively, using evidence, etc. Postmodernism will question the explanation of everything through science. The idea of making everything a science and explaining the world through in rational scientific terms often presupposes that you can create enough distance from it, or sorry, there's a lot of typos, and look at things the way they are. So the postmodernists question where you're standing. Where are you standing when you're looking at that perspective? What are you bringing to the situation? How are you seeing things as they are without already being tied up in them? Another word for that is how do you account for your bias? You can't get to a neutral stance. Now, a lot of this might sound pretty antiquated, but I want you to try to recognize that most of us have been in the wake of postmodernism for quite for our entire lives, and probably most of our parents' lives, and so a lot of this won't seem too radical to us specifically, but at the time this was huge. This was a really big break with tradition, or the conventions of the time. So everything is interpreted from somewhere, according to the postmodernists, through a language, through a history, through a culture. Science is a cultural construct. It's not removed from the world, not removed from culture. That doesn't mean there's no reliable knowledge. Remember that. Science tells us many great things, but it's not neutral knowledge, is what they're saying. So I like to say to students often, I ask people if they're political or not, or where they stand in terms of their interest in politics. And if you, in your head or virtually raised your hand and said, I don't like politics, the postmodernists would say that's just as much of a stance as someone saying they do like politics. It means you're not neutral. You're not exempt. By saying you don't like something, that just means that you've taken a position of not liking something. I'm not going to go through all this, but I do want you to recognize these terms, right? So there's an attack on totality, on claims to totality or overarching explanations in postmodernism. So this idea of trying to come up with answers that are universal are starting to be attacked as, authoritative explanations of things. So we might start to key into some of these terms like relational. We only know things through our relationships to people, institutions, and things, and you gain real and specific knowledge through your own encounter or how you relate to something. It's important to note that this is not absolute knowledge, okay? This is, I'm not saying that you come to absolute knowledge through that, but it's when we start to talk about this activated spectator or seeing yourself see, this is an acknowledgement of things in the world and your experience in the world being relational. So this interruption of a strategy as a strategy, right? From John Cage, we talked about that, and I would say Rauschenberg's a good example of that as well. We lead into what becomes called conceptualism. It was initially called idea art, but art that was that prefaced the idea or the concept becomes the most central to understanding what's communicated over how it looks, how it's made, or what it's made of. When a work of art is withholding most of what you expect and associate with artwork, it's probably a strategy, and that's something to key into when you're experiencing. So if John Cage is withholding something from us in his composition, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, it's probably a clue, right, for us to start to question, why would John Cage do this, right? So I'm going to go ahead and pause here